It all started on a quiet suburban street in the small town of Milford, Ohio, where the Johnson family had just moved into an old, slightly run-down house. At first glance, it seemed perfect white picket fence, creaky wooden floors that groaned in protest underfoot, and a dusty attic full of forgotten treasures. It was the kind of place that whispered secrets if you listened closely, and maybe that was the first clue they should have paid attention to. The Johnsons were a typical family. Mark, the father, a software engineer with a quiet demeanor and a skeptical mind. Laura, the mother, a nurse who had a soft spot for old antiques. Ethan, their curious 12-year-old son, who loved horror movies and urban legends. And Sophie, their 8-year-old daughter, innocent yet oddly perceptive for her age. One rainy afternoon, as Laura was unpacking boxers in the attic, she stumbled upon a small, tattered box that had clearly been hidden behind some old furniture. Inside was a doll, unlike any she had ever seen. Its head was slightly too large for its tiny body, its eyes glassy and unnervingly lifelike, with a faint golden glint that seemed to follow you as you moved. Its hair was a dull shade of brown, and it wore a faded, moth-eaten dress. Scribbled on the bottom of the doll's foot, almost like a warning, were the words, Lubobo. Laura felt a shiver run down her spine, but thinking it was harmless, decided to clean it up and give it to Sophie as a gift. Sophie, delighted, named it Lubobo immediately and began carrying it everywhere. That night, as the wind howled outside and rain lashed against the windows, Ethan noticed something strange. From the corner of his room, he thought he saw Lubobo's head tilt slightly, as if acknowledging him. He blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the shadows cast by the streetlights. But later, when Sophie went to sleep, her soft giggles transformed into muffled cries. Laura rushed into her room to find Lubobo sitting upright on the bed, perfectly still. Sophie under the covers, eyes wide and frozen with fear, whispering that the doll had moved on its own. Mark laughed nervously, blaming overactive imagination, but Ethan's unease grew. Over the next few days, small incidents started accumulating. Doors would slam shut by themselves. Lights flickered. Even when the power was stable, Sophie would wake up in the middle of the night, speaking to Lubobo in a voice that was not her own, saying things like, "You shouldn't be here," and he sees you at first. The family chalked it up to stress from moving, but the unease became impossible to ignore when Ethan saw Lubobo in the kitchen, standing on the counter, though no one had placed it there. Its glassy eyes stared straight at him, and for a brief second, he swore he saw a faint smile curl on the doll's lips. Mark, rational as ever, decided to put Lubobo back in the attic, thinking distance would solve the problem. But the moment the doll was left alone in the dark, a whisper echoed through the hallway. "I'm never far." That night, the Johnsons barely slept, and the following morning, Laura found scratches along the walls of Sophie's room, forming patterns that resembled ancient symbols she didn't recognize. As days passed, the doll's influence grew stronger. It wasn't content with simply sitting in corners anymore. It began appearing in places the family had left it, on the living room sofa, in the bathroom, even staring down from the top of the stairs. Its eyes seemed to glow faintly at night, casting eerie reflections on the walls. Sophie's demeanor changed too. She spoke less and often, muttered strange warnings about a shadow man that came at night. Ethan tried to record the movements on his phone, but every video either ended with static or the doll inexplicably missing from the frame. One evening, Mark returned home from work to find the living room in disarray, furniture overturned, the air thick with a chilling cold that made his breath visible. Lubobo sat in the middle of it all, head tilted, eyes unblinking. He reached for it, intending to throw it out, but as his fingers touched its tiny, cold hand, a voice low, guttural, almost emanating from the doll itself, whispered his name. Terrified, he dropped it. The house seemed to close in around them, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. That night, Laura woke to screams. She found Ethan standing in the hallway, staring at the basement door, trembling. Sophie was nowhere to be found, but Lubobo sat on the first step, grinning. The whispers grew louder. "She belongs to me." It was then they realized Lubobo wasn't just a doll, it was a vessel, an ancient entity bound to torment those who crossed its path. The Johnsons tried everything, burning it, locking it away, even contacting paranormal experts. But the doll always returned. Every attempt made it angrier, its presence more oppressive. The walls seemed to breathe, the floors groaned, like the house itself was alive, and each night brought new horrors. The entity within Lubobo fed on fear, and now it had a growing appetite. Objects flew across rooms, chilling drafts swept through closed windows, and Sophie began speaking in tongues, her small body shaking violently. Lubobo clutched in her tiny hands. Mark and Laura were at their wits' end, desperate to save their children from a fate they could neither comprehend nor fight. The situation escalated one stormy night when the power went out completely. Darkness enveloped the house. The Johnsons huddled together in the living room, clutching flashlights like then they heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from upstairs. It wasn't Sophie. It wasn't Ethan. It was Lubobo. Mark's rational mind screamed to ignore it, but fear rooted him to the spot. The humming grew louder, almost hypnotic, filling the house with an unnatural resonance that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Laura, shaking, whispered to Mark that they had to go up and retrieve the doll before something irreversible happened. They crept up the stairs, the wood beneath their feet groaning ominously. Each step seemed to echo, as if announcing their presence to something unseen. When they reached the top, they found the hallway empty, but the door to Sophie's room slowly creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was transformed. Shadows danced violently on the walls, the air thick with a metallic scent. Lubobo sat on the bed, but it was no longer just a doll, it was larger somehow, looming, and its eyes burned with an unnatural golden light. Sophie was huddled in the corner, whispering incomprehensible words in a voice that did not belong to her. Mark and Laura froze, realizing that the doll was controlling her, feeding off her fear, manipulating her body like a puppet. Ethan, braver than ever, grabbed a baseball bat and charged, but before he could reach the bed, the doll lunged toward him with impossible speed, vanishing into the shadows, leaving only a faint echo of laughter that chilled him to the bone. They tried to run, but the house had changed. Doors led to hallways that weren't there before. Stairs twisted impossibly, looping back on themselves. The Johnsons were trapped inside a nightmare that seemed to breathe with a mind of its own. Windows became mirrors, reflecting twisted, distorted versions of themselves, showing horrific fates should they fail. The doll appeared in each reflection, closer and closer, its eyes promising pain and torment. Desperate, Mark grabbed an old book from the attic he had seen earlier, a dusty volume filled with cryptic symbols and incantations. Remembering vague advice from a local paranormal expert, he began chanting aloud, hoping to banish the entity. The air around them pulsed with energy, shadows shrieking as if alive, walls vibrating in protest. But Lubobo was clever. It had no single form, slipping between physical and ethereal planes, mocking every attempt to contain it. As the chanting continued, Sophie's body convulsed violently, her eyes glowing faintly golden, mirroring the doll's gaze. It was clear now that the entity was transferring its essence into her, planning to make her permanent host. Laura, panicked, tried to wrest the doll away, but invisible forces threw her across the room, slamming her into a wall. Blood ran from her forehead, but the terror in her eyes was dwarfed by the expressionless stare of Lubobo, now floating inches above the bed, as if reveling in the chaos it had wrought. Time became meaningless. Each second stretched into eternity, each shadow a threat. Ethan noticed a faint outline of a door in one wall, a hidden portal that hadn't been there before. Without thinking, he grabbed his sister and his mother and ran, dragging Laura through the door. They tumbled into a cold, damp basement of some unknown origin, lit by flickering candlelight that seemed to appear from nowhere. Mark was right behind them, his hands trembling but determined. The doll was not far. Lubobo's giggle echoed through the house, omnipresent, omniscient. It taunted them, mocking their efforts, its influence growing stronger with each heartbeat. But the basement offered temporary refuge, a pause in the relentless nightmare. They noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, glowing faintly. Mark realized these were containment runes, left perhaps by someone who had encountered Lubobo before. But the protective circle they traced with the symbols was fragile, and any mistake could doom them. The family huddled together, trying to steady their racing hearts. Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling as if mourning the souls trapped inside the house. Yet, even in this brief moment of respite, the sense of dread never left. Lubobo was patient, intelligent, and sadistic. It would wait, observe, and strike when least expected. And the worst part, they knew it could not be destroyed. Every attempt made it stronger, more cunning, more malevolent. Ethan whispered a trembling question. "Mom, what if it never stops?" Laura could only hug him tighter, her own fear mirrored in his eyes, knowing deep down that the doll had already marked them. The shadows in the basement seemed to shift independently, forming grotesque shapes that resembled figures from Ethan's horror movies, but far more sinister, far more alive. Lubobo's whispers slithered through the cracks of the walls. "You belong to me. You all belong to me." Even Mark, the skeptic, felt a paralyzing wave of despair. The doll was no longer an object. Tay really said it was an entity with a mind, a will, and a thirst for domination. And somewhere in the attic, somewhere in the house above, Lubobo waited, patient, hungry, unstoppable. Days passed, though the Johnsons lost all sense of time. The house had become a labyrinth of horror. Every room they entered seemed to warp reality. Hallways extended impossibly. Doors led to rooms that shouldn't exist, and mirrors reflected a world where Lubobo ruled. The family attempted to escape, to leave Milford entirely, but the town itself seemed influenced. Roads twisted, leading them back home. Even their car refused to stop, lights flickering in synchronization with the doll's glowing eyes. Lubobo's power had grown exponentially, feeding off fear, manipulating reality, controlling the environment. Sophie, now fully possessed at times, spoke directly, Lubobo's voice, issuing threats that chilled the adults to the bone. The house is mine. You can never leave. You belong here forever. At night, the family endured terrors beyond imagination. Walls bled black ichor. Shadows dragged themselves along the floor, whispering their deepest fears aloud. The entity toyed with them, giving brief moments of hope before snatching them back into despair. Then one night, Ethan, who had been silently observing patterns in Lubobo's appearances, noticed something, a momentary flicker when the doll returned to its inanimate form. A window, a brief moment, a pattern he could exploit. He convinced his parents to distract Lubobo with chanting and noise, drawing its attention while he grabbed Sophie. As he crossed the basement threshold, he noticed the containment runes glowing faintly, reacting to the presence of Lubobo. Heart pounding, he began reciting incantations from the dusty book, his voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. The room quaked violently. Lubobo shrieked, a sound that seemed to pierce the very soul. The entity attempted to resist, its voice blending with Sophie's in a cacophony of terror, demanding obedience. But the runes held. Slowly, agonizingly, the glow enveloped the doll, and for the first time, Ethan saw Lubobo falter. The golden eyes dimmed, the body shuddered, and the whispers became desperate pleas. Finally, with one final, ear-splitting scream, Lubobo's form collapsed, inert once more. Sophie fell into Ethan's arms, crying but alive. The house was silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. Though scars remained, the Johnsons realized that the doll could be contained, but never destroyed entirely. Somewhere, in shadows or hidden corners, Lubobo waited, patient, gathering strength for the next family foolish enough to take it home. The experience left them haunted, their trust in reality shattered, their peace a fragile illusion. They buried the doll deep beneath the earth behind the house, marking the spot with symbols from the book, hoping it would remain undisturbed. But deep down, all of them knew the truth. Horror never really ends. It only waits watching, whispering, planning its return. And somewhere in the darkness, Lubobo's glassy eyes would open again, and it would smile.